On the morning of February 19, 1983, 19 commercial fishermen were found dead across 3 boats moored in Naknek, Alaska, a Bristol Bay fishing village where the smell of diesel and salmon guts never quite leaves the air. All men. All killed within a 4-hour window during the thickest fog the bay had seen in a decade. The weapons, shotguns, rifles, and gaff hooks, those long poles with razor-sharp steel points used to land massive king salmon. The perpetrators weren't rival syndicates or outside criminals. They were the Anderson family, a father and his 4 sons who'd worked these same waters for 3 generations. The Alaska State Troopers would later call it the deadliest fishing dispute in the state's history. But the catalyst wasn't territory, wasn't competition over prime fishing grounds, wasn't even the ongoing tensions between old Norwegian families and the Filipino crews flooding into Bristol Bay. It was a single commercial salmon net, slashed to ribbons one night at the dock, worth maybe $850 to replace, and the certainty, never proven but believed down to the bone, that the crew of the Kodiak King had done it to send a message. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Bristol Bay stretched across southwestern Alaska like a vast gray-green wound in the earth. 270 miles of coastline where the Bering Sea crashed against tundra and volcanic rock. In 1983, the region held roughly 7,400 souls scattered across villages that existed for one reason only: salmon. Naknek, population 678, sat on the Alaska Peninsula's north shore, accessible only by plane or boat for most of the year. No roads connected it to Anchorage, 300 miles northeast. No highways led anywhere except to smaller villages, even more isolated. February in Bristol Bay meant temperatures that hovered around 18 degrees Celsius during the day, dropping to single digits at night. The kind of cold that turned your breath to ice crystals in the air, that made exposed skin go numb in under 3 minutes, that killed careless men who fell overboard into 34-degree water and had maybe 8 minutes before hypothermia shut down their hearts. The smell along the docks was diesel fuel mixed with old fish blood, frozen into the wooden planks, creosote from the pilings, and that particular scent of the sea in winter. Salt and kelp and something ancient and indifferent to human suffering. At 4:30 in the morning, when the few operating boats fired up their engines for winter crab work, the sound echoed across the frozen bay like artillery. By 6 a.m., when daylight finally broke weak and gray over the eastern mountains, you could see maybe 200 yards through the fog that rolled in off the Bering Sea like a living thing, thick and wet and cold enough to soak through any jacket. But 1983 wasn't just another brutal Alaska winter. Bristol Bay's salmon fishery was in the middle of a boom that had transformed the region from subsistence villages into one of the most valuable fisheries on Earth. The previous summer's sockeye run had hit 43 million fish, a record. Prices had climbed to $1.20 per pound at the dock. For the families who'd worked these waters since their grandfathers emigrated from Norway in the 1890s, this should have been a golden age. But the boom had brought problems. Too many boats, too many new faces, too many outsiders willing to work for less, fish harder, and bend the unwritten rules that had kept the fishery stable for generations. The old Norwegian families, Andersons, Johansons, Petersons, watched their traditional territories get crowded, their catches threatened, their way of life compressed by economics and competition they couldn't control. And in Bristol Bay in 1983, your boat wasn't just transportation, it was your kingdom. Your salmon net was sacred. $850 in materials, yes, but also hundreds of hours of hand mending, the specific knot patterns your grandfather had taught you, the exact mesh size that caught sockeye but let smaller fish escape. When someone cut your net, they weren't just costing you money. They were telling you that you didn't matter, that your family's 3 generations of honest work meant nothing, that the old codes were dead. Gunner Eric Anderson, everyone called him Bull, was 54 years old that February, though the Alaska weather had aged him until he looked closer to 65. He stood 6'3", 245 pounds of muscle, built from 38 years working the unforgiving waters of Bristol Bay. His hands were massive, scarred from 1,000 encounters with steel cable, fish hooks, and the jagged edges of ice that formed on every surface when spray froze in sub-zero wind. A thick, red-gray beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes were the pale blue of glacial ice, the kind that looked through you rather than at you, calculating whether you were threat or ally or just another obstacle. Every morning Bull woke at 4:15 a.m. in the small house he'd built himself on the edge of Naknek, overlooking the frozen bay. The house was simple, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a workshop where he repaired nets and engines, but it was his, built with his own hands on land his father had purchased in 1947 for $300 cash. He'd make coffee in an old percolator that had belonged to his grandfather, drink it black while standing at the window, watching darkness over the ice. Then he'd drive his 1979 Ford F-250, brown with rust eating through the wheel wells, down to the Naknek dock, where his boat, the Anderson's Pride, waited. Named after his father, dead now 11 years from lung cancer, that came from smoking unfiltered Camels for 50 years. Bull had married Astrid Johansson in 1951, right after he came back from 2 years in Korea, where he'd learned that cold could kill you faster than bullets. They'd had 4 sons, Eric, 32 years old, working as Bull's deckhand and heir apparent, Lars, 29, who'd just bought his own boat on credit from the bank in Dillingham, Magnus, 26, still learning the trade but strong as an ox, and Christian, the youngest at 23, who'd tried college in Anchorage for 2 semesters before realizing his future was here on the water with his family. Astrid was 52 now, a small woman with iron gray hair she kept in a tight bun, hands roughened from 3 decades of mending nets and processing fish at the cannery during boom seasons. What Bull valued most wasn't money, though he needed every dollar to keep the Andersons' Pride running. The boat carried a 47,000 note at the bank. Diesel had at 1.85 per gallon. Engine parts had to be flown in from Anchorage at criminal markup. Everything was getting tighter, meaner, more desperate. What Bull valued was respect. The knowledge that when Gunner Anderson gave his word, it was solid as the steel hull beneath your feet. The understanding that his family name meant something in Naknek, that 3 generations of Anderson men had fished these waters honestly, followed the rules, and never sabotaged another man's gear. The Kodiak King had arrived in Naknek in 1981, a 52-foot aluminum-hulled gill netter owned by Victor Reyes, a Filipino captain who'd worked his way up from deckhand to boat owner through sheer relentless effort. Victor was 41, built compact at 5'8", with weathered brown skin and eyes that constantly scanned for the next opportunity, the next angle, the next competitive edge. His crew included his 2 younger brothers, Ramon and Tomas, plus his son Michael, 19, and a rotating cast of Filipino workers willing to endure Alaska's brutal conditions for wages they'd never see in Manila. They worked harder than the Norwegian families liked to admit, fished longer hours, took more risks, and slowly, incrementally, they'd been encroaching on Anderson territory in the western section of Naknek Bay. Bull had complained twice, politely, respectfully, once at the dock in August 1982, once at the Fishermen's Co-op meeting in September, asking Victor to respect the traditional boundaries that had kept the Norwegian families from killing each other for 80 years. Victor had listened, nodded, said all the right words. then continued fishing wherever the salmon were thickest. Boundaries be damned. By January 1983, the tension had become visible. At the fuel dock, Anderson boats came in at different times than the Kodiak King. At the Red Dog Saloon in Naknek, the only bar for 50 miles, Bull and his sons sat on one side of the room, while Victor's crew occupied the other. Wives who'd once exchanged recipes at the general store now avoided each other, but it was still just tension, still manageable, still within the bounds of civilized conflict. Until February 14, 1983, Valentine's Day, February 14, 1983, 2:30 a.m., temperature 11 degrees. The moon was a waning crescent, providing almost no light beyond what the stars offered through gaps in the fog. Bull Anderson woke to the sound of his dog, a half-wolf Malamute named Odin, barking with the particular urgency that meant wrong, threat, danger. Bull pulled on his insulated coveralls, grabbed the flashlight he kept by the bed, and walked outside. The cold hit like a fist. His breath crystallized instantly. Odin was at the fence, hackles raised, staring toward the dock a quarter-mile away. Bull climbed into his truck, drove down the rutted ice road to the Naknek dock. The town was silent. Nobody fished in February except a few diehards running king crab traps. The fog was thick enough that his headlights barely penetrated 20 feet. He parked, walked out onto the dock. His boots echoed on frozen planks. The Andersons' pride sat at her usual slip. 38-foot wooden gill netter his father had built in 1955, maintained with religious care for 28 years. Bull climbed aboard, checked the wheelhouse, the engine compartment, the hold. Everything looked normal. He almost convinced himself Odin had been barking at a bear or a fox. Then he went to check his net. Commercial salmon gill nets in Bristol Bay run 300 feet long and 29 meshes deep, about 15 feet when deployed. Bull's net was stored in the stern, carefully stacked on the net reel, ready for the June salmon opener, still 4 months away. It represented $850 in materials. Yes, but also 200 hours of his time hand-tying knots his grandfather had taught him, adjusting mesh size to the millimeter, waterproofing with the specific compound that worked best in 40-degree water. The net was destroyed, not torn by accident, slashed. Long, deliberate cuts through the mesh at 3-foot intervals. Whoever had done this had used a sharp knife and taken their time, methodically ruining every section. Bull stood there in the 11-degree darkness, flashlight beam moving across the carnage, and felt something cold settle into his chest. The same feeling he'd had in Korea in 1951, when his platoon walked into an ambush and he'd understood in one crystalline moment that he was about to kill or be killed. He knew who'd done this. Everyone would know who'd done this. February 14th, 7 a.m. Bull sat at his kitchen table with Astrid and their 4 sons. Outside, daylight was breaking weak and gray. The coffee tasted like ash in his mouth. "They cut the net," Bull said. His voice was flat, emotionless. 300 feet, completely destroyed. Eric, the oldest at 32, closed his eyes. "Reyes. Had to be. Nobody else has reason." "You sure?" Lars asked. He was 29, trying to be the voice of reason. "Could have been. It was Reyes," Bull said. "Or his crew. Same thing." Magnus, 26 and the most physical of the brothers, slammed his fist on the table. "So we go over there right now and—" "And what?" Astrid's voice cut through. She stood at the stove, not looking at them. "You start a fight, get arrested, lose the boat." "They destroyed $850 worth of gear, Ma," Christian said. He was 23, the youngest, still angry in the way young men are angry before life teaches them that anger without direction just burns you up inside. "So we call the troopers," Astrid said. "File a report. Let the law handle it." Bull shook his head slowly. "Troopers are in Dillingham, 50 miles away. They'll write it up, ask questions, file it somewhere. Nothing happens. Then the insurance—" doesn't cover sabotage unless we can prove who did it. Bull looked at his wife. 32 years married to a woman who'd stood by him through every brutal season, every failed catch, every time the bank threatened to take the boat. And we can't prove it. No witnesses, no evidence except a cut net that could have been anyone. So what do we do? Eric asked quietly. Bull didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the frozen bay where fog rolled in like a siege, where his boat sat with a destroyed net, where Victor Reyes's Kodiak King was moored 3 slips down, its crew probably laughing about what they'd done. We remind them, Bull finally said, that there are rules, that you don't touch another man's gear, that actions have consequences. What kind of consequences? Magnus asked. Bull turned from the window. His pale blue eyes had gone cold, the color of glacial ice that kills, the kind that makes sure this never happens again. February 15th, 1983, 3:47 p.m., Bull Anderson drove his truck to Dillingham, 52 miles northeast on the only road that stayed semi-passable in winter. The trip took 2 hours through blowing snow and ice fog so thick his headlights barely penetrated. He parked outside Northern Outfitters, a sporting goods store that catered to hunters heading into the Alaska range. He bought ammunition, 12 boxes of 12-gauge shells, Federal premium buckshot, 9 pellets per shell, $11.95 per box, 8 boxes of 30 Aussie 6 rounds for the hunting rifles he and his sons kept for moose and caribou, $16.50 per box. The clerk was a young white kid, maybe 22, with a wispy mustache and a University of Alaska Fairbanks sweatshirt. "Big hunt coming up?" the clerk asked, making conversation while he rang up $275.60 worth of ammunition. "Something like that," Bull said. At a second store across town, he bought more shells. Winchester, different shot size, another $187. At a marine supply shop on the edge of Dillingham, he purchased 50 feet of 3/8-inch steel cable, the kind used for securing crab pots in heavy seas, $94, and 4 heavy-duty padlocks, brass cylinders with hardened steel shackles, $68 total. He kept all the receipts, tucked them in his wallet behind his commercial fishing permit, his boat registration, and a faded photograph of Astrid on their wedding day in 1951, her in a simple white dress, him in his only suit, both of them impossibly young and unaware of what Alaska would demand from them. Some part of Bull, the part that had been raised in a Lutheran church, that had been taught to follow laws and respect authority, thought maybe those receipts would matter later. Evidence that he'd purchased everything legally. Evidence that he'd followed the rules right up until the moment he couldn't anymore. On the drive back to Naknek, Bull's hands shook on the steering wheel. The road stretched through white wilderness, endless tundra and stunted spruce trees, and mountains that looked like broken teeth against the gray sky. He drove with the windows cracked despite the cold, needing the shock of frozen air to keep him present, to prevent him from turning around. He'd just crossed a line, not irreversible, not yet. He could still throw the ammunition in the bay, forget this whole thing, file an insurance claim, buy a new net, and move on with his life. But he didn't. He kept driving south toward Naknek, toward whatever was coming, toward a decision that would stain Bristol Bay red and destroy everything his family had built. That same afternoon, while Bull Anderson loaded ammunition into his truck, Victor Reyes sat in the wheelhouse of the Kodiak King, drinking Budweiser with his brothers Ramon and Tomas. The boat rocked gently in its slip. Outside, fog had rolled in so thick you couldn't see the opposite side of the harbor, maybe 200 yards. "You think Anderson knows it was us?" Tomas asked. He was 35, the middle brother, more cautious than Victor. Victor shrugged. "Probably, but what's he going to do? File a report? We deny it. No proof. He could come after us, Ramon said. At 38, he was the oldest, the one who'd seen the most violence back in Manila before they'd emigrated in 1975. These Norwegian families, they don't forget. Let him come, Victor said. There was bravado in his voice, but also calculation. We got 6 men on our crew. He's got 4 sons. We outnumber him. Numbers don't matter if he's got guns, Tomas said quietly. Victor set down his beer. Everyone's got guns in Alaska, but Anderson's not stupid. He knows that if he starts something, the troopers come down on everyone. He'll lose his boat, his permit, everything. He's got too much to lose. So do we, Ramon said. Yeah, but we didn't spend 3 generations building a reputation here. We got nothing to prove except that we're not going to be pushed around by families who think they own the bay. They sat in silence for a moment. The boat creaked. Outside, a foghorn sounded from somewhere across the harbor. One long, mournful note that faded into the white void. Why'd you cut his net? Tomas finally asked. I know he was fishing our spots, but... Our spots? Victor turned to his brother. There are no our spots. The bay belongs to whoever has a permit. Anderson thinks because his grandfather fished here first, he's got some kind of divine right. Well, I got news for him. We got the same permits he does. We pay the same fees. We follow the same regulations. The only difference is his family's been doing it longer. That matters to them, Ramon said. That, Victor said, is their problem. This isn't Norway. This is America. Competition, free market. The best fisherman wins, not the one with the oldest family name. Ramon looked at his older brother, saw the anger there, the resentment that had been building for 2 years of being treated like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong, saw the pride that wouldn't let Victor back down, even when backing down might save lives. Just be ready, Ramon said quietly, because if Anderson comes, he won't come alone. February the 16th, 1983. Evening, Bull Anderson sat in his workshop behind the house, surrounded by tools and spare engine parts, and the smell of motor oil and wood smoke from the stove he kept burning against the cold. His father's Remington 870 shotgun lay across his workbench, 12-gauge, pump-action, purchased in 1948. Bull had learned to shoot with this gun when he was 10 years old. His father had taught him, respect the weapon, know your target, understand that once you pull the trigger, you can't call the shot back. Bull's 4 sons sat around the workshop on old chairs and overturned crates. Eric, Lars, Magnus, Christian, all of them understanding without being told that they'd gathered for something more serious than routine gear maintenance. They cut the net, Bull said, not explaining who they were. Everyone knew. $850, 200 hours of work, but it's not about the money. It's about respect, Eric said quietly. Bull nodded. Your grandfather came to Alaska in 1927 with $73 in his pocket and a promise that if you worked hard, if you played by the rules, if you respected the waters and the people who fished them, you could build something, a legacy. Not wealth, we've never had wealth, but something solid, something you could pass to your sons. He paused, looking at each of them in turn. Victor Reyes doesn't respect that, doesn't respect the boundaries, doesn't respect the work we've put in. He thinks because he's got the same commercial permit, he's got the same rights. But rights and respect aren't the same thing. Rights are what the government gives you. Respect is what you earn. Or take, Magnus said. Bull looked at his 3rd son. Magnus was 26, the most physical, the one who'd been in bar fights, the one who still thought problems could be solved with fists. Or take, Bull agreed. So what are we doing, Pa? Christian asked. At 23, he was the youngest, still looking for his place in the family hierarchy, still trying to prove he was as tough as his older brothers. Bull stood, walked to the window, Through the frost-covered glass, he could see the lights of Naknek, a few dozen houses, the cannery, the dock where the Andersons' Pride and the Kodiak King sat 3 slips apart. "The fog's been getting thicker every night," Bull said. "Weather service says it'll be the worst. Tomorrow night, visibility under 50 feet. The workshop went silent, everyone understanding what Bull wasn't saying directly. "We're going to board them?" Lars asked. He was 29, married with a 1-year-old daughter, the one with the most to lose. "Pa, if we do that, if we actually do that, there's no coming back." "I know. The troopers are 52 miles away in Dillingham," Bull said. "And in fog like tomorrow night's, even if someone called them, they couldn't fly, couldn't drive fast. We'd have hours." "Hours to do what?" Lars's voice had risen slightly. "What exactly are we talking about here?" Bull turned from the window, his pale blue eyes, glacial ice that kills, moved across his sons' faces. "We're talking about making sure Victor Reyes and his crew understand that there are consequences, that you don't come into our waters, take our fish, and destroy our gear without paying a price." "You mean hurt them?" Christian said. "I mean teach them," Bull said. "Hurt, yes, but more than that. Make them understand down to their bones that what they did was wrong, that the Anderson family won't be disrespected." Eric spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Pa, I'm with you, whatever you decide, but I need to know, how far are we going?" Bull didn't answer immediately. He picked up the Remington 870, felt its familiar weight, remembered his father teaching him to shoot ptarmigan in the tundra behind their house, remembered Korea, remembered the North Korean soldier he'd killed with this exact shotgun during a night raid in January 1951, a kid, maybe 19, who'd looked surprised in that final second before the buckshot took him. Bull had been 22 then. He was 54 now, and he'd spent 32 years trying to forget that surprised look, that moment when he'd become a killer. "As far as necessary," Bull finally said, "until they understand." The words hung in the cold air of the workshop. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 7 degrees. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows, carrying the smell of the frozen bay and the promise of fog that would roll in tomorrow night, thick and concealing and perfect for men who needed darkness. "I can't," Lars said quietly. "Pa, I've got Emma and the baby. If this goes wrong, if we get caught, I lose everything." Bull looked at his second son, saw the fear there, but also the pragmatism. Lars was right. He did have the most to lose. "Then you stay home tomorrow night," Bull said. "No shame in that. This is my choice, not yours." "If you're going, I'm going," Eric said immediately. "You raised me to stand with family." Magnus nodded. "I'm in." Christian hesitated, looked at Lars, then back at his father. "Me too." Lars stood up, paced to the other side of the workshop, stood there with his back to them. Bull could see his shoulders shaking, not from cold, from the weight of the decision. "God damn it," Lars whispered. Then, louder, "God damn it, Pa, you're putting me in an impossible position." "I'm giving you a choice," Bull said. "Stay home, take care of your family. Nobody will think less of you." Lars turned around. His eyes were wet. "If something happens to you and my brothers and I wasn't there, I'll think less of me." He walked back to the group, sat down. "I'm in all the way." Bull felt something break in his chest. He'd just conscripted all 4 of his sons into something that could destroy them, but the code was clear. You protect what's yours, and you punish those who take it. "Tomorrow night," Bull said, "we wait for the fog. We board the Kodiak King first. That's where Reyes and his brothers sleep. Then we hit the other 2 boats his crew uses. Quick, surgical, done before anyone can react." "Weapons?" Magnus asked. "Shotguns and rifles, but we're not trying to kill anyone." Then what are we trying to do? Christian interrupted. Bull looked at his youngest son. We're trying to send a message written in blood and pain. We're trying to make sure that every fisherman in Bristol Bay knows you don't fuck with the Anderson family. February 17th, 1983. 11:34 p.m. The fog had rolled in exactly as predicted, thick, wet, and cold enough to freeze on contact with any surface. Visibility was maybe 40 feet. The temperature had dropped to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. The only sounds were the gentle slap of water against hulls and the distant hum of generators keeping boats' batteries charged. Bull Anderson sat in his truck, parked 200 yards from the Naknek dock, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, he could see nothing but white fog, thick as cotton, impenetrable, perfect. His 4 sons sat in Eric's truck, parked right behind Bull's. 5 men, 6 shotguns, 3 hunting rifles, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. Bull had expected his hands to shake, expected fear, maybe even doubt at this final moment. Instead, he felt a cold, crystalline clarity, the same feeling he'd had in Korea right before a patrol, when terror transformed into focus and every sense sharpened. He picked up his father's Remington 870, checked the chamber one more time. 5 shells loaded, Federal Premium double-aught buckshot. Bull opened the door. The dome light had been disabled hours ago. 5 men climbed out of 2 trucks and moved through the fog like ghosts, boots nearly silent on the frozen ground. They approached the dock. The Kodiak King sat at slip 7, a 52-foot aluminum gill netter that even Bull had to admit was well maintained. Lights were on in the wheelhouse. Through the fog, Bull could see movement inside. Someone still awake. 11:47 p.m. Bull and his sons spread out according to the plan they'd rehearsed in the workshop. Eric and Magnus would board from the bow. Bull and Christian from the stern. Lars would stay on the dock, covering the gangway in case anyone tried to escape. Bull stepped onto the Kodiak King's deck. The boat rocked slightly under his weight. He moved toward the wheelhouse, shotgun raised, finger on the trigger guard. Inside, Victor Reyes sat at the navigation table, working on paperwork, probably maintenance logs or next season's fishing plan. He wore a thick wool sweater, reading glasses perched on his nose, a mug of coffee steaming beside him. Bull tried the wheelhouse door, unlocked. Fishermen in Naknek didn't lock their boats. No need. Everyone knew everyone, and theft was nearly unheard of. Until now. Bull stepped inside. The warmth hit him immediately. The wheelhouse heater was running, making the small space almost comfortable. Victor looked up. Their eyes met. Understanding dawned on Victor's face. Not surprise, but confirmation. He'd known this was coming, had probably known since the moment Ramon cut that net. Anderson, Victor said. Not a question, just acknowledgement. Reyes. A long moment of silence. The boat rocked gently. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like something alive. You hear about the net? Victor's voice was steady, but his right hand was moving slowly toward the drawer under the navigation table, where Bull knew from decades of experience most fishermen kept a pistol. Don't, Bull said quietly. The shotgun barrel moved slightly, centering on Victor's chest. Victor's hand froze. He sat back slowly, hands visible on the table. So this is how it's going to be? You're going to shoot me over an $850 net. It was never about the net, Bull said. It was about respect, about you coming into our waters, taking our fish, and thinking there wouldn't be consequences. Your waters? Victor's voice hardened. I've got the same commercial permit you do, same license, same rights under Alaska law. The bay doesn't belong to you just because your grandfather fished it first. Rights, Bull said, and respect aren't the same thing. No, they're not. And you want to know the difference? Rights are something nobody can take from you. Respect is something you demand when you don't have an argument. Bull felt anger surge, hot and sudden. You cut my net. You sabotaged my gear. You laughed about it. I didn't laugh about anything. But you did it. Victor was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah, I did it. Because you and your family act like you own Bristol Bay. Act like because you've been here longer, the rest of us should bow and scrape and fish wherever you decide we're allowed to fish. Well, I got news for you, Anderson. Those days are over. Bull stared at the man who'd just confessed to destroying his livelihood. Saw no remorse, no fear, just defiance. Just the certainty that he was right. That the old codes meant nothing. That competition was all that mattered. Where are your brothers? Bull asked. Why? Where are they? Victor's eyes flicked toward the door leading below deck. Sleeping in the berths. They didn't have anything to do with... They were there. They knew. They benefited. Bull's voice was cold. That makes them complicit. They're innocent. Nobody's innocent, Bull said. Your crew, your brothers, your son, all of them profited from what you did. All of them laughed while you told the story at the Red Dog. All of them need to understand what happens when you cross the Anderson family. Victor stood up slowly, hands still visible. You kill me. You kill my brothers. You kill my crew. You think that ends this? You think the troopers are just going to let it go? You'll spend the rest of your life in prison. Maybe, Bull said, but you'll be dead, and everyone in Bristol Bay will know why. Victor's face changed then. The defiance cracked, and underneath Bull saw something else. Fear, yes, but also understanding. Understanding that he'd miscalculated, that the old codes weren't as dead as he'd thought, that some men still believed honor was worth killing for. My son is 19, Victor said. His voice broke slightly. He's just a kid. Old enough to fish, old enough to know right from wrong. Please, Victor whispered, take it out on me, but let my family go. Bull thought about his own sons waiting outside, thought about Lars's 1-year-old daughter, who would grow up without a father if this went wrong, thought about Astrid's face when the troopers came to arrest him. Then he thought about his destroyed net, about 3 generations of Anderson men who'd played by the rules and watched their livelihood get compressed by men who didn't respect tradition, about his grandfather's voice, never let anyone make you look weak, Gunner. The moment you allow disrespect, you become prey. You made your choice when you cut my net, Bull said. Now you pay for it. Victor lunged for the drawer. Bull fired. The shotgun blast was deafening in the enclosed wheelhouse. Victor Reyes was thrown backward against the bulkhead, the front of his wool sweater suddenly dark and wet. He slid down slowly, leaving a red smear on the white-painted wall behind him. Bull stood there, ears ringing, looking at the body of a man he'd known for 2 years, waited for guilt, for horror, for something human, felt only cold satisfaction that one debt had been paid. From below deck he heard shouting, footsteps on the ladder. Ramon Reyes appeared in the doorway, took in the scene, his brother's body, Bull with the smoking shotgun, and his hand went to his belt where a filleting knife hung in a leather sheath. Don't, Bull said. Ramon pulled the knife anyway, 8-inch blade, razor sharp from a lifetime of cleaning salmon. He came fast, desperate, screaming something in Tagalog. Bull stepped aside, let Ramon's momentum carry him past, then brought the shotgun's stock down hard on the back of Ramon's head. The blow made a sound like a mallet hitting a watermelon. Ramon went down, knife clattering across the deck. Bull chambered another round, pointed the shotgun at Ramon's head. The man was still conscious, dazed, trying to get up. Stay down, Bull said. You killed my brother. Ramon's words were slurred, thick with blood from where he'd bitten his tongue in the fall. And you helped him cut my net. It was just business. No, Bull said. It was disrespect, and now you're learning what that costs. He pulled the trigger. Ramon Reyes stopped moving. 11:58 p.m. Bull moved through the Kodiak King like death itself. Below deck, he found Tomas Reyes in the aft berth, waking to the sound of gunshots, fumbling for the light switch. Bull shot him before he could stand. In the forward berth, he found Michael Reyes, Victor's 19-year-old son, trying to squeeze through a porthole that was far too small, his legs still tangling in the sleeping bag. "Please, Mr. Anderson," Michael sobbed. "I didn't do anything. I didn't even know about the net." Bull looked at the kid. 19. Same age Bull had been when he'd joined the army, when he'd thought the world made sense and followed rules. "Your father should have thought about you before he started this," Bull said. "He was trying to feed us, trying to build something for our family just like you." Bull hesitated, his finger on the trigger. One more death, one more soul on his conscience, a kid who probably hadn't cut the net, who'd just been following his father's lead, trying to be a good son. Bull Anderson stood in the cramped forward berth of the Kodiak King, shotgun aimed at a terrified 19-year-old boy who was half tangled in a sleeping bag, trying to squeeze through a porthole built for ventilation, not escape. Michael Reyes looked up at him with eyes that held no defiance, no anger, just pure animal terror, the kind of fear that strips away everything else and leaves only the desperate, pleading desire to keep breathing for one more minute. "Please," Michael whispered again. "I got a girlfriend. We're supposed to get married this summer. Please, Mr. Anderson. I didn't know." "Your father knew," Bull said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow, mechanical. "You were there when he bragged about it at the Red Dog." You laughed. I was trying to fit in with the crew. I didn't think." "That's your problem," Bull said. "You didn't think." From above deck, Bull heard his son Eric's voice. "Pa, 2 more down here." 2 more. That meant the Kodiak King's other crew members, the Filipino deckhands Victor had brought up from Seattle for winter crab season. Bull had known there would be others, had planned for it. But standing here, looking at Michael Reyes's terrified face, something cracked in Bull's chest. Not guilt, not yet, but a flicker of recognition. This kid looked like Christian had at 19. Same desperate hunger to prove himself. Same blind loyalty to a father who'd led him into disaster. Bull's finger tightened on the trigger. 1 pound of pressure, maybe 2. That's all it would take. Michael closed his eyes, whispered something that sounded like a prayer in Tagalog. Bull pulled. The trigger. Click, empty chamber. The shotgun had run dry. Bull stood there, listening to that hollow mechanical sound echo in the small berth. Stood there while Michael opened his eyes, saw the empty shotgun, understood he'd just been given a reprieve by pure chance. Bull could have reloaded, had shells in his pockets, could have taken 10 seconds and finished what he'd started. Instead, he lowered the shotgun. "Get out," Bull said quietly. "Swim to shore, run, don't stop, don't look back, and don't ever come back to Bristol Bay." Michael stared at him, not understanding, not trusting this sudden mercy. "Now," Bull roared. Michael scrambled through the porthole. Somehow his terror gave him the flexibility to squeeze through that impossible space. Bull heard a splash as the kid hit the 34-degree water, heard desperate gasping as Michael swam through the darkness toward shore, toward hypothermia, toward life if he was lucky and fast. Bull stood there in the berth, breathing hard, trying to understand why he'd stopped, trying to understand why a 19-year-old's face had been the line he couldn't cross when he'd already crossed so many others. 12:04 a.m., February 18, 1983. Bull climbed back up to the wheelhouse. His boots left prints in Victor Reyes's blood. The air smelled like gunpowder and copper and the particular burnt meat stench that comes with close-range shotgun wounds. Eric appeared in the doorway, Magnus behind him. Both had blood on their jackets. "The two deckhands?" Bull asked. "Dead," Eric said flatly. "They were sleeping in the crew quarters, didn't even wake up." Bull nodded. 4 dead on the Kodiak King. Victor, Ramon, Tomas, and 2 crew members whose names Bull had never learned. 6, counting the ones he'd planned to eliminate, minus Michael, who was either swimming to shore or already dead from hypothermia. "There are 2 more boats," Magnus said. "The Pacific Dawn and North Star, both part of Reyes's operation. Crews sleep aboard during winter." Bull looked at his third son. Magnus was 26, and his eyes had changed in the past 15 minutes. They'd gone flat, empty, the look of a man who'd killed and found it easier than expected. "How many crew total?" Bull asked. "Pacific Dawn has 5, Eric said. "North Star has 4, but Pa—" He paused. "Are we really doing this? Going boat to boat?" Bull reloaded his shotgun. The shells clicked into place with mechanical precision. They all knew, they all benefited, they all need to understand. Understand what? Lars's voice came from the doorway. He'd left his position on the dock and climbed aboard. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. "Pa, what are they going to understand if they're dead?" Bull looked at his second son, the cautious one, the one with the most to lose. "Everyone else will understand. Every fisherman in Bristol Bay, every crew that thinks about cutting someone's gear or disrespecting the old families, they'll know what happened to the men who crossed the Andersons. They'll know we're murderers," Lars said. "They'll know we killed 15 people over a fishing net." 13, Bull corrected, "and it was never about the net." "Then what the fuck is it about?" Lars's voice cracked. "Because I just helped you kill 4 men, and I need to know it was for something more than your pride." The word hung in the cold air of the wheelhouse. Pride. That's what it was, ultimately. Not justice, not even revenge. Just the desperate, violent assertion that the Anderson family mattered, that 3 generations of honest work meant something, that you couldn't disrespect them without consequences. Bull didn't answer, couldn't answer, because Lars was right and they both knew it. "The other boats," Bull said instead. "We finish this." 12:23 a.m. The Pacific Dawn sat 2 slips over a 48-foot wooden gill netter that had seen better days. Rust streaked her white paint. Her nets needed mending, but she was seaworthy, and her crew, 5 Filipino men ranging in age from 24 to 51, worked her hard during salmon season. Bull approached with Eric and Magnus. Lars and Christian stayed behind on the Kodiak King, Lars sitting on the deck with his head in his hands, Christian standing watch with a rifle he'd never fired at anything but caribou. The Pacific Dawn was dark. Her crew was asleep below deck in the cramped quarters that smelled of diesel fuel and sweat and the fish they'd been processing earlier that day. Bull tried the cabin door, locked. He looked at Magnus, nodded toward the door. His third son raised his boot and kicked hard. The lock was cheap, installed by men who'd never imagined they'd need real security. It splintered on the second kick. Bull descended the ladder into darkness, pulled out his flashlight, swept the beam across the crew quarters. 5 men in sleeping bags on narrow bunks, all of them stirring now, waking to the sound of boots on the ladder, to the beam of light cutting through their space. "¿Qué pasa?" one of them said, the oldest, a man named Ernesto Cabral, 51 years old, who'd been fishing Alaska waters for a decade. "Who's there?" Bull raised the shotgun. His hands were steady now. Whatever hesitation he'd felt with Michael Reyes was gone, burned away by the momentum of violence. "Anderson," Bull said. Ernesto sat up slowly, hands raised. "Please, senor, we are just workers. We don't want trouble." "Should have thought about that before you took my fish. We don't take nothing." Another voice, younger, Paulo Mendoza, 28, who'd left Manila 2 years ago to escape poverty, and found himself in a Bristol Bay berth with a shotgun pointed at his face. "We fish legal, we got permits, we follow all laws." "You fished my waters," Bull said. "You helped Reyes encroach on Anderson territory. You knew what he'd done to my net." "We didn't know nothing about no net." Paulo was crying now, tears streaming down his face. "Please, we are just trying to feed our families back home. We send money to Manila every month. We got children." Bull felt something twist in his chest. These men, they were just workers, hired hands following orders. They hadn't cut his net, probably hadn't even known about it until after the fact. But they'd benefited. They'd fished the territory that Reyes had claimed by sabotaging Anderson gear. They'd profited from disrespect. Where was the line? How far down the chain of complicity? Did guilt extend? Bull's finger tightened on the trigger. From behind him, Eric's voice. "Pa, these men didn't do nothing. They're just crew." "They fished our waters," Bull said. "So did half the fleet. You going to kill everyone who drops a net in Naknek Bay?" Bull turned to look at his oldest son. Eric stood on the ladder, rifle in hand, but his face was conflicted, no longer the cold certainty from an hour ago. "They work for Reyes," Bull said. "That makes them—" "Employees," Eric said. "Not accomplices. Pa, there's a difference." In the bunks, the 5 Filipino men held their breath, waiting, understanding that their lives hung on this conversation between a father and son in a language some of them barely spoke. Bull looked at them. 5 men, 5 fathers, brothers, sons, 5 people who'd left their homes and traveled to one of the harshest environments on Earth for the slim hope of a better life. Just like Bull's own grandfather had done in 1927. "Get out," Bull finally said. "All of you, get off this boat, swim to shore, leave Alaska. If I ever see any of you in Bristol Bay again, I'll finish what I started tonight." The 5 men scrambled from their bunks, grabbed whatever clothes they could find, and fled up the ladder. Bull heard splashes as they jumped into the black water, heard gasping and desperate swimming toward the shore 200 yards away. Bull stood in the empty crew quarters, breathing hard, trying to understand why he'd stopped again, trying to understand where his certainty had gone. Eric put a hand on his shoulder. "Pa, we need to go. Someone's going to hear the shots. Someone's going to call the troopers." Bull looked at his son. "One more boat." "Pa." "One more," Bull said. "The North Star. Reyes's cousin runs it. 4 crew. They knew. They were at the Red Dog when Victor bragged about cutting my net. I heard them laugh." Eric was quiet for a moment. Then, "If we do this, if we hit the North Star, we're not stopping because we're done. We're stopping because there's nobody left." Bull nodded. "Then that's how we stop." 12:47 a.m. The North Star was a newer boat, only 3 years old, 50 feet of fiberglass and aluminum that represented everything the old Norwegian families resented: modern, efficient, operated by people who had no connection to Bristol Bay's history. Her captain was Ricardo Reyes, Victor's cousin, 38 years old, who'd emigrated from the Philippines in 1977 and worked his way up from deckhand to captain through sheer relentless effort. His crew included his younger brother Antonio, 32, and 2 other Filipino fishermen, Benito Cruz and Joseph Villarreal, both in their late 20s. The North Star sat at the far end of the dock, 300 yards from the Kodiak King. Bull and his 4 sons approached through fog so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. When they were 50 yards away, Bull stopped, raised his hand. From the North Star, he could hear voices shouting. Someone had heard the gunshots from the Kodiak King. Someone had radioed the other boats. They knew. Bull saw movement on the North Star's deck, saw the silhouette of a man holding something, a rifle probably, or a shotgun. "Anderson," Ricardo's voice cut through the fog. "I know it's you. I know what you did. Bull didn't answer, spread out his sons in a line, Eric and Magnus to the left, Lars and Christian to the right, all of them armed, all of them understanding that this was different now. This wasn't execution, this was a fight. You murdered my cousin, Ricardo shouted. You murdered his brothers. You think you can just walk onto my boat? You knew what he did, Bull shouted back. You laughed about it. It was a fishing net, Anderson. Just a fucking net. You killed 15 people over fishing gear. It was respect, Bull roared. Something you people don't understand. You're insane, Ricardo's voice cracked. You're a fucking murderer. The troopers are coming. You're done. Bull raised his shotgun. Not until I finish what I started, he fired. The blast illuminated the fog for a split second, long enough to see Ricardo dive behind the wheelhouse, long enough to see muzzle flash as Ricardo returned fire. The bullet went wide, but close enough that Bull felt the shockwave as it passed his head. And then it was chaos. Eric and Magnus opened fire on the North Star, their rifles cracking in rapid succession. Return fire came from at least 3 positions on the boat. Lars was shouting something, maybe stop or get down, but his voice was lost in the gunfire. Bull ran forward, staying low, using moored boats for cover. He reached the North Star's gangway, charged up onto the deck. Antonio Reyes appeared from behind the mast, swing a gaff hook, 7 feet of hardwood pole with a razor-sharp steel hook at the end. He caught Bull across the chest. The hook tore through Bull's jacket and the shirt underneath, opened a 6-inch gash across his ribs. Bull grunted, stumbled backward, brought the shotgun up. Antonio swung again. Bull ducked, felt the hook pass inches from his skull, fired point blank. Antonio went down. From the wheelhouse, Ricardo emerged with a .30-30 rifle. He got 1 shot off. The bullet punched through the North Star's aluminum cabin wall, 6 inches from Bull's head, before Magnus shot him from the dock. Ricardo fell backward through the wheelhouse door. Bull moved through the boat, systematic, methodical, found Benito Cruz, hiding in the engine compartment, shot him. Found Joseph Villarreal trying to start the boat's engine, maybe thinking he could escape into the fog, and shot him through the wheelhouse window. 4 more dead. Bull stood on the North Star's deck, breathing hard, blood running from the gash across his ribs. The fog was starting to thin slightly. Dawn was still 2 hours away, but the absolute darkness was lifting. From the shore, Bull heard a sound that made his blood freeze. Sirens. 1:14 a.m. Bull and his sons ran, left the boats, left the bodies, left everything except their weapons and the terrible knowledge of what they'd done. They reached Bull's truck, piled in, drove away from the Naknek dock with lights off, navigating by memory and the faint illumination from houses. How many? Lars asked. His voice was dead, emotionless. Bull didn't answer immediately. He was counting in his head. Kodiak King, Victor, Ramon, Tomas, 2 crew. Pacific Dawn, none. He'd let them go. North Star, Ricardo, Antonio, Benito, Joseph. 9, Bull said. Maybe 10 if Michael didn't make it to shore. 15, Christian said quietly. I saw the Pacific Dawn crew swim to shore. Then I saw 2 of them collapse on the beach. Hypothermia. They didn't get up. Bull closed his eyes. 11 dead, because men couldn't survive long in 34-degree water, and he'd sent them into it knowing some wouldn't make it. There are more boats, Magnus said. Reyes had connections to at least 8 other Filipino crews. If we... No, Bull said. The word came out harder than intended. We're done. But they'll... We're done, Bull repeated. We go home. We clean ourselves up. We wait for the troopers. They drove in silence through the fog. Behind them, Naknek was waking to catastrophe. Sirens shouting, the discovery of bodies on 3 boats. The worst mass killing in Alaska history. February 18, 1983, 7:30 a.m. Alaska State Trooper Sergeant James Halloran stood on the deck of the Kodiak King, looking at bodies, trying to understand how neighbors had done this to each other. Halloran was 43 years old, 18 years with the troopers stationed in Dillingham. He'd investigated bar fights, domestic murders, the occasional plane crash, but he'd never seen this systematic elimination of an entire fishing crew across multiple boats. By 9 a.m., the count was clear: 11 dead. Victor Reyes and his two brothers, Ricardo Reyes and his crew, two Filipino workers from the Pacific Dawn who died of hypothermia trying to reach shore, 4 others missing, presumably drowned or still swimming somewhere in Bristol Bay. The pattern was unmistakable. Every victim connected to Victor Reyes's fishing operation, every death violent, close range, personal. Anderson, Halloran's partner, Trooper Linda Vasquez, said quietly. Has to be. Halloran nodded. Bull Anderson had filed a complaint about a cut net 5 days ago, had confronted Reyes publicly, had purchased massive amounts of ammunition in Dillingham 3 days ago. The sporting goods clerk remembered him because of the quantity. Where is he now? Halloran asked. Home, Vasquez said. We drove past on our way here, saw his truck in the driveway, lights on in the house. He's not running. No, sir, Andersons don't run. They face what comes. February 18th, 1983, 10:15 a.m. 6 Alaska State Troopers and 4 officers from the Naknek Village Public Safety Department approached the Anderson house on the edge of town. 10 officers total, body armor, rifles ready. They found Bull Anderson sitting on his front porch, in a wooden chair, unarmed, hands visible, resting on the armrests. His 4 sons stood behind him in a line: Eric, Lars, Magnus, Christian, also unarmed, also calm. Astrid Anderson stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, face wet with tears. Sergeant Halloran got out of his vehicle slowly. He'd known Bull for 15 years, had bought salmon from him, had drunk with him at the Red Dog Saloon, had attended the same community meetings about fishing regulations. Bull, Halloran said, I expect you know why we're here. I do. I need you and your boys to come with us. Bull stood slowly. He was wearing clean clothes, pressed flannel shirt, canvas pants, boots polished, like he was going to church instead of jail. His left side was bandaged where Antonio's gaff hook had caught him. We're not going to make this difficult, Sergeant, Bull said. We did what needed doing. Now we'll face what comes next. The 4 sons filed forward, hands raised. No resistance, no drama, no last stand. Just 5 men who'd crossed a line and now accepted the consequences with the same grim determination they'd shown when planning the massacre. Halloran put the handcuffs on Bull personally. As he did, he asked the question that had haunted him since 7:30 a.m. Was it worth it, Bull? 11 men dead over a fishing net. Bull looked at his house, at the bay where he'd fished since he was 6 years old, at the land his family had worked for 3 generations, at everything he was about to lose forever. Ask me in 20 years, Bull said. Right now I'm still too close to say. They loaded all 5 Anderson men into separate vehicles, drove away while Astrid watched from the porch, one hand covering her mouth, the other clutching a dish towel so tightly her knuckles went white. But as the vehicles disappeared into the morning fog, Sergeant Halloran couldn't shake one terrible thought. In Bristol Bay, in Alaska's most isolated communities where law enforcement was hours away and the old codes ran deeper than any statute, was Bull Anderson a murderer? Or was he just the last man willing to enforce rules that everyone else had forgotten? The courts would decide guilt. But guilt and right aren't always the same thing.